Hunger broke them.
Cold sealed them.
But it was fire that bound them forever.
There was no grave.
Only two shadows fused into coal.
And a silence that still weeps among the ruins.
A whisper among ashes.
A promise broken by history.
And an embrace.
That not even the devil dared depart. Do you remember that winter, Charles? The year Ireland stopped breathing? The year hunger didn't arrive with the crows, but with the English ships.
1847. The darkest point of the Great Irish Famine. But the horror didn't come from the land. It came from power.
It all began with a fungus, Phytophthora infestans, an invisible plague that rotted the potatoes from within. The harvest turned black. The staple food vanished, but the real cancer was the empire.
The British kept exporting wheat, meat, and oats from Ireland, while its people died, disfigured by hunger. It was like watching a nation devour itself, while its executioner wiped his hands with loss.
Sligo was not a city. It was a wound, a port town where coffins outnumbered ships. The air was poisoned with death, and in the streets, people looked like ghosts.
Sometimes, mothers buried their children in empty boxes, not because they wanted to, but because the body could no longer finish dying whole.
And while all of that was happening, the two of them met. A young woman gathering dry branches, and a boy who had already sold his soul for a crust of bread.
Ooh, they had nothing, but they had each other.
And in a world where faith was shattered, the only miracle was their embrace.
No one remembers the exact day he was born, only that it was winter, and the frost wouldn't melt, not even with fire. Aidan learned to walk on mud and bones, and to stay silent when soldiers spoke.
He grew up among cursed words in Gaelic and prayers whispered to a God who had long stopped answering. His mother, a woman with hollow eyes, stitched crucifixes with threads of old linen. She said the crosses kept the crows away, but Aidan knew that crows fear nothing.
By the age of 10, he was already digging trenches with men who had stopped dreaming. At 12, he buried his father with a broken shovel and an empty stomach. And at 13, he began to walk. Not out of faith, not out of destiny, only because staying smelled like death.
He became a shadow, slept where there were no barking dogs, ate what even the dogs wouldn't touch. He stole bread, but prayed before eating it, not because he believed in God, but because silence made him feel less guilty.
Once he was offered work, an English farm, far from his village. But when he arrived, they handed him a shovel and pointed to a trench. It wasn't for planting, it was for digging graves.
From then on, he stopped looking people in the eye because every gaze was a story he didn't want to carry. Sometimes, when the wind fell silent, he heard voices, not of ghosts, but of his own body, reminding him he was still alive.
He didn't know love nor the future, not even rest. He only knew the noise of his stomach, the creak of his bones, and the weight of a life he never asked for.
Bry was born among whispers, in a house without windows, in a bed where her mother died that same night. She never heard her voice, only the echo of her absence. Her father said hunger wasn't a curse, but divine punishment. And every time there was no bread, he made her pray harder, more than once, with his knuckles marked on her back.
She was 5 when she saw her sister die of cold. 10 when she buried her with her own hands.
The nuns at the convent called her the girl with dead eyes, not because she didn't feel, but because she felt too much and didn't know how to survive it.
On winter nights, she would lie down against the warmest wall, not to sleep, but to remind herself she was still alive.
Bry didn't speak. She listened to those who cried, to those who lied, and to those who prayed out of habit.
An old man in the village said her soul was like a dress soaked in blood. Beautiful, but irreparably torn.
She learned to weave, not to sell, but to entertain her sadness. She treated it like an old friend.
She didn't seek love. She didn't believe in it. She knew that love, like bread, was scarce in her world.
And yet, every time she woke up, she did so with the same look. The look of someone who, though broken, still hadn't given up. It was in Sligo, but not on any ordinary day. It was the day when the dead no longer fit inside the churches.
The air smelled of rotten wood and broken promises.
Aidan had arrived from the east, dragging his feet, hiding his face beneath a tattered scarf. He had 2 rusted coins and a loose tooth. He was looking for food, but not for himself, for an old blind man who offered him a corner to sleep in exchange for stale bread.
Bry, meanwhile, was knitting at the edge of the market where women sold the clothes of their dead children, and men gambled with bones, because there were no cards or dice left.
They didn't look at each other, not at first. Aidan walked past, used to not seeing. Bry kept her head down, trained not to be seen.
But then came a voice that didn't come from them. A scream. A boy stealing a chunk of raw meat from a military stall. The soldiers reacted like hyenas.
They crossed paths in the same instant. He shoved the boy into an alley. She threw her basket straight at the soldier's face.
Bry saw it too, and for the first time in years, she ran.
They crossed paths in the same instant. He shoved the boy into an alley. She threw her basket straight at the soldier's face.
It was a second, just one, but that second changed everything.
The boy escaped. The guard bled from his brow, and they ran.
They ran through narrow alleys, through nameless bodies and hungry barking. They ran without knowing who the other was. They only knew that in that moment, being together meant not dying.
They hid behind a wall. Aidan was bleeding from the knee. Bri trembled without making a sound. They didn't say thank you or hello, not even a name.
They just looked at each other, and for the first time, they saw something that wasn't death.
They stayed in silence, backs pressed against the damp wall, hearts trying not to beat so loudly.
Aidan breathed heavily. Bri clenched her fists, not out of fear, but from not knowing what to do with her hands when she wasn't alone.
He was the first to speak, but he didn't ask her name. He just said, "Are they after you too?"
She didn't answer. She just shook her head, because her voice got stuck in the same place where all the screams she could never release stayed.
In the distance, the soldiers' footsteps faded away, and the world returned to its habit of pretending nothing was happening.
They didn't leave right away. They didn't even trust the light. The alley smelled of dampness and old corpses, but at least it didn't smell of gunpowder.
"Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head again, but her knees were trembling. Inside, something was breaking. Not because someone had hurt her, but because someone had stopped it.
They walked, not together, a few steps apart. She kept her eyes to the ground. He looked at the sky, as if expecting a curse.
When they reached the pier, she stopped. Aidan stopped too, without meaning to.
"That's where I'll stay," she said. It was her first complete sentence.
He nodded. He was going to keep walking, but he didn't, because the pier smelled of death. And for the first time, he didn't want to smell it alone.
They sat in silence, watching the rotten water, the empty ships, and the gulls that didn't sing.
The sun didn't rise, but it didn't dare to leave either. And there, without realizing it, they began to breathe the same air.
They weren't friends. They weren't allies. Just two survivors, who for the first time weren't running alone.
There were no flowers, no promises, no first dates under the rain. Only a piece of bread, split in two, without having to ask for it.
Sometimes love doesn't enter with trumpets. It arrives, like the silence after the gunshot, like warmth on a night without fire, like the only voice that doesn't yell at you.
The next day, Aidan returned to the pier, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't not do it. Bri was already there, her gaze lost, and a dry branch between her hands.
They didn't say anything, but they walked together, this time closer.
He found a piece of rotten apple, wiped it clean with his sleeve, and offered it to her as if it were a feast. She smiled, barely, but it was the first time her lips moved without fear.
The words came later, small, timid, like birds that no longer trust the sky. "My mother's name was Niamh," he said one day. Bri didn't answer. She only said, "Mine died without a name."
They began weaving stories between their silences. He spoke of rivers, she of the sounds wood makes when it breaks. They had no future, so they shared the past.
One night it rained so much, they thought the world was dissolving. They sought refuge in an abandoned house where the roof cried more than they did.
He offered her his coat. She didn't accept it, so he put it on her anyway, without her noticing.
That night, they didn't sleep, but they didn't shiver as much either.
With time, Aidan began speaking less about death and more about what life together could be if one day hunger surrendered.
And Bride closed her eyes without fear again, because if she died in the night, at least she wouldn't die alone anymore.
They didn't kiss. They didn't embrace. They didn't need to, because love, in its purest form, makes no noise.
It only breathed, and it kept them alive when everything else wanted to see them dead.
It wasn't a declaration, nor an awkward touch in the middle of the night. It was a blink that lasted longer than normal, a breath that no longer tried to hide the trembling.
It was in that broken house, where the floorboards creaked with every step, where the mirrors no longer reflected anything but dust and weariness.
That night, they didn't talk about the future, but they didn't fear it either. The fire was small, the blanket insufficient, but their bodies were starting to feel less like strangers.
She looked at him steadily, without looking away, without asking for permission, and he didn't run. If the world ends tomorrow, she said, then let's choose each other today.
And he nodded, but not with his head, with his hands trembling as they held her, with his eyes, which for the first time didn't avoid looking straight.
There was no kiss. It wasn't needed, because that moment was more intimate than any brush of lips.
From that day on, they didn't just share bread or stories or shelter. They shared a name, even if they never said it out loud.
And the world, for the first time in a long while, felt a little less cruel. Because although nothing had changed outside, inside, something had just been born. Something that neither hunger, nor war, nor death could kill so easily.
In the beginning, they only walked, without direction, without any compass, but the other's heartbeat. Hunger followed them like a loyal dog, and the cold, like an old enemy they already knew by name.
They slept wherever they could. An abandoned stable, the shadow of a windmill, the least damp corner of a ruined church. They made no plans. They only counted hours without dying.
One night, Aidan stole a piece of raw meat. He didn't ask what animal it came from. He just ran, and Bry waited for him in silence, hiding among the roots of a rotting tree. When they ate, they did it without speaking. They only looked at each other as if the other were a miracle.
Sometimes they found work, washing blood in a slaughterhouse, collecting bones from the fields, carrying coffins for a handful of dirty coins. They never asked questions, and they never stayed long.
One morning, Bry woke with a fever. She shivered like wet paper. Aidan walked 3 hours just to get a scrap of linen and some cheap moonshine. He didn't know how to heal, but he knew how to stay.
Sometimes people kicked them out. Trash, they yelled. Bread thieves, sewer rats. But they kept going, together, without a flag, without a roof, but together.
Bry began to talk more. Small things, memories, dreams that weren't completely broken yet. And Aidan listened, as if each of her words was a nail holding his pieces together.
One afternoon, a boy threw a stone at them. Aidan wanted to yell at him, but Bragg stopped him. She only looked at him and said, "It's not worth bleeding for those who are already empty."
And it was then, after so many shattered days, that fate gave them a small reprieve. A dying old blacksmith told them of a forgotten cabin on the other side of the forest. "No one wants it anymore," he said, "but if you can get there, maybe it'll leave you in peace for a while."
They crossed the forest in 3 days, soaked, hungry, chased by the echo of gunfire. But when they saw that cabin, Bry found an abandoned cabin sunken in weeds, its walls cracked like her soul. There, without saying it, they decided to live, not for comfort, but because they no longer wanted to die apart.
They had no furniture, only stolen blankets, damp logs, and a corner where the wind blew less fiercely. But each night they were less two strangers and more a single wound closing together.
He left early, to gather wood, food, scraps, whatever he could. She wove, not to sell, but to cover the cracks in the roof, or in her chest.
Sometimes they laughed, very quietly, as if laughing were a crime, as if happiness could bring bad luck. But they laughed, and that was enough.
One day, Bry drew a map. She couldn't read, but she remembered stories of faraway lands where children didn't die with their eyes open. "America," she said, as if the word hurt on her tongue. Aidan didn't answer. He only looked toward the horizon as if he could see the face of fate.
Each night, they invented futures. A real house, a field with fertile soil, a child running barefoot, a whole loaf of bread. Dreaming cost nothing, but it hurt just the same.
An old man told them about a ship. He said it would sail in weeks. He said if they worked for him, he could help them escape. Aidan agreed without hesitation. Bryce smiled without trusting.
They built their love like someone repairs a ruined cabin, with trembling hands, with borrowed materials, and with the certainty that the wind will return someday. But even so, they built. It was a morning without sun, no rain, no visible hope. Bry sat longer than usual, with her hand over her belly and her eyes fixed on a place that didn't exist.
Aidan arrived empty-handed, but when he saw her, he felt he was carrying something. Not food, destiny.
She didn't say, "I'm pregnant." She only whispered, "We're going to need another piece of blanket." And he understood.
There were no shouts, no jumps, no explosive joy. There was silence and a lump in the throat, not from fear, but from meaning.
The love that until then had been a refuge became a purpose. They no longer looked at each other just for comfort, but to affirm to themselves, we are alive and someone is coming who deserves more than this.
They returned to the map, spread it over the broken table, and America was no longer a dream. It was a promise, an obligation, a debt to that child who had yet to breathe.
Aidan reinforced the roof, searched for stronger wood, learned to make rudimentary traps to catch something more than cockroaches. Bri wove until her fingers bled, blankets, diapers, tiny garments that smelled of hope.
There were nights when they didn't speak. They simply stayed awake, looking at the corner where the baby would sleep. And in that silence, the world finally felt distant, as if out there could no longer reach them.
"We're going to make it," he said. And this time, Bri believed, not because she had proof, but because those words were spoken by someone who was no longer running alone. On another day of survival, while they waited for the right moment to escape from everything that was happening then, Aidan had left at dawn. He said he'd come back with something warm. He promised bread, or at least clean water. Bri nodded. She didn't want him to see her worried, because she knew how much it hurt to fail.
Oh, I'm feeling low again. They said I owe to them. They don't wanna let it go.
That morning, Bri walked to the eastern trees where sometimes, very rarely, the branches offered more than shade. She found 2 blackberries, one crushed, the other almost a miracle. And then she saw them.
3 men, military clothes, but no flag, no honor, only hunger in their eyes, but not for food.
She tried to run, but she didn't scream, because in Sligo, screaming was an invitation to death. And she still wanted to live, even if it was with fear.
There were no words, only hands. And then, a silence so heavy that even the birds never sang again. They left her there, among branches, as if she wasn't worth even the mud covering her.
Aidan found her hours later, her coat torn, her gaze empty, as if she had gone and left her body behind.
She said nothing. Neither did he. He just carried her, like someone carrying something they no longer know how to heal.
That night, Bri didn't move, and the next day, the blood returned, but not to her veins, to between her legs. She made no sound, only clenched her teeth and let it all go.
The child, the map, the hope, the air, everything left with that blood.
Aidan cried, not in front of her, but in the rain, like men who no longer know how to be men, because he hadn't protected her, because he didn't arrive in time, because that child was all they had.
And that night, they didn't speak. They didn't eat. They didn't dream. They only existed, side by side, but farther apart than ever.
Aidan did everything to distract her. He built a fence, planted an apple seed, invented a song with no rhyme or rhythm. But nothing was enough, because there are pains you can't touch with your hands or mend with love.
The body healed, but something in her never came back. Bri didn't speak at dawn, nor laugh at dusk. And in her eyes, it wasn't the same winter anymore. It was another, longer, crueler.
The phrase wasn't new, but this time it hurt differently, as if she wasn't talking about herself, but about what had already died inside. Aidan didn't answer. He only stood up and looked for the map she had drawn, unfolded it, smoothed it over the table, and with a piece of charcoal marked an X over the word America.
It was a promise, a decision, a last bet. Not for them, but for what they still had left to lose. Hope.
That same night, Aidan returned to the village. He looked for the old man from the pier, the one who spoke of ships, of secret passages, and of opportunities paid for with work or silence. He found him, old, smelling of salt and lies. "Is it still on?" he asked. The old man nodded. "We sail in 4 nights. There's no turning back."
He returned to the cabin with his soul full of wind, and for the first time in weeks. Bri was waiting for him, standing, groomed, with moist eyes, and a folded blanket under her arm. "Yes," she said, as if she had heard his thoughts. Weeks had passed since that conversation in the cabin. The old man at the dock had given them his word. A boat, a moonless night, a departure with no witnesses.
It wasn't much, but it was all they had. So Aidan began trading firewood for nails, and Bri knitted as if every stitch could hold the future together.
Each day, they walked a little farther, learning routes, counting steps, avoiding shadows.
And every night they checked the small cloth bag where they kept the essentials. 2 dried apples, an almost faded photograph, and a promise
not to look back.
The old man from the dock had told them, "The boat leaves in 7 nights. Be ready!" And they were.
But on the 6th night, the eyes of a man followed them for too long. A neighbor, or a traitor, or perhaps just someone hungry for coins.
That same night, soldiers began patrolling near the forest. One asked about a suspicious couple. Another laughed while sharpening a knife.
Aidan knew the deal was broken. The boat would leave, but not with them.
Bri didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply gathered her things with steady hands, like someone preparing a body for burial.
And so, with hearts pounding like war drums, they left the cabin on the 7th night. Not as fugitives, but as 2 souls who no longer fit in the hell they had been born into.
But hell hadn't let them go.
A whistle, a gunshot, a scream that wasn't theirs, and footsteps, dozens of footsteps.
They were waiting for them.
Betrayal didn't come with a knife in the back. It came with torches, with dogs, and with the brutal certainty that there would be no boat, no America, no tomorrow. That night, they weren't running toward freedom. They were running for their lives, for what little was left of them.
The rain chased them as if trying to save them, but it couldn't run as fast as hate.
The dock was too far, the time too short, and fear so close it breathed down their necks.
They turned off course by instinct like wounded animals and found refuge in the same cabin where they had once promised each other a future.
Aidan slammed the door shut. Bri looked for something to bar it with, but the silence outside didn't last long.
Shouts, bangs, boots in the mud. the brutal breaking of the entrance.
They came in like raging shadows. One went straight for Bry. Aidan saw it, and he threw himself at him like a wild beast.
It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. They grabbed him from behind. They struck his head, his back, his stomach, and when he fell, they kicked his soul out of him.
Bry screamed. She tried to reach him, but they grabbed her too. A blow bent her over herself. Another threw her to the floor.
They left them lying there, gasping, bleeding, shaking.
And then one of the men looked around, smiled, and said something Bry would never forget. Let the fire finish what we started.
They lit a torch and threw it into the dry corner of the cabin. The flames took seconds to grow.
Then they shut the door from the outside and locked it with chains.
They didn't want them to escape. They wanted them to burn. With the pain. With the blood. With the love. They never understood.
The fire didn't come in screaming. It came like winter. Slow, cruel, but inevitable. Aidan, half dragging himself, reached Bry. They were both bleeding, but they were still breathing. And as the smoke began to swallow everything, they looked at each other as if nothing else existed. He took her hand, his voice trembled, but his eyes did not. Aidan, weak, broken voice. I thought the world had taken everything from me until I found you. You were the miracle I never asked for, and yet you gave me everything.
Bry could barely speak, but her lips didn't hesitate. Bry, whispering, you taught me that love wasn't a luxury, it was resistance, and every day with you was a victory against the world.
They leaned, forehead to forehead. The fire was getting closer. The heat already hurt.
But they didn't cry for death. They cried for what they had lived, for the seconds they did have. Aidan, almost a whisper. Do you remember when we were running and the mud covered our boots? And still, you laughed as if the sky was watching us.
Bry, smiling through tears. I remember when you said, I want my child to be born in a place where bread isn't hidden. And for a moment, we believed such a place existed. The flames were already climbing the walls. The wood cracked like a scream held back.
Then they embraced, for the last time, not as those who fear the end, but as those who honor the journey. Aidan, with his last breath, let the world know that we loved each other even when loving was a crime.
Bry, with her last words, strength and breath, and that among hunger, hatred, and death, there was still a corner for love. In 1847, Ireland burned from within, and they were just one more story the fire couldn't erase, because true love leaves no ashes, it leaves memory.
Years later, among the remnants of the past, archaeologists found what seemed impossible.
2 skeletons, burned, locked in an embrace, as if not even death could have separated them.
Forensic tests dated the bones to 1847, the heart of the Great Famine, one of the cruelest winters in Ireland.
They had no names, no letters, no portraits, no witnesses, only ashes and an embrace untouched.
Many said they might have been lovers, others that they died by accident, but no one knows. Only one certainty remains.
That among so much hatred, hunger, and fire, they chose to love each other. Until their last breath, until the last crack of the wood.
Perhaps their names were lost, but their story endured in silence, waiting to be told.
And today, in this corner of the world that has forgotten so many things, one truth remains.
Amid so much death, there was love